I want to welcome you to Between Skepticism and Mysticism, an introduction to the occult philosophy of Cornelius Agrippa. This entire lecture series on the foundations of the occult philosophy is brought to you totally free of charge, completely open access by the incredibly generous folks that support my work over at my Patreon. This is all a bit of an experiment on providing free content through crowdsourcing education on topics that are just honestly rarely taught in universities at all. And when they are taught, a single class can cost thousands of dollars. If you'd like to support the production of university level open access education and topics in Western esotericism, I'd hope you consider taking a look at my Patreon, which you can join for as little as $54 a year. It's like buying me a cup of coffee or a beer once a month. But thank you so much for your consideration of supporting the channel and the work like this, and thanks to the patrons of this channel for making this lecture series possible. All right, everyone, welcome back to the summer seminar on Cornelius Agrippa, which is quickly turning into the autumn seminar on Cornelius Agrippa. I hope it does not become the winter seminar on Cornelius Agrippa, but we are really in the thick of it now and really coming up to the what might be the apex in some ways of the class. Now, there are two things I want to say about that. The first is that, in some sense, yes, we are going into sort of the apex of the occult philosophy, at least the 1510 version, and honestly, the 1533. Agrippa doesn't fundamentally change what's going to happen in the sort of nuts and bolts of all this by the difference in those 23 years. But we are coming to the apex in terms of the illumination. Now, the second thing I want to say about that is that I don't want people to drop off after we cover this part of the class. I think many people are coming here basically because they want a seminar on the three books of occult philosophy. Let me implore this upon you. Let me just say two ways of imploring this upon you. The first is Agrippa wrote more things than just the three books of occult philosophy. He wrote more mystical and occult things than the three books of occult philosophy. The three books of occult philosophy may not represent, and I do not think represents, his mature position. If you want Agrippa's mature position, whatever that is, we're going to have to read more stuff and talk about more things. In fact, that'll be the whole next part of this course, is actually looking at all the other things that Agrippa wrote that are not the three books of occult philosophy, and that also are not the De Vanitate, the On the Incoherence, but they are other occult works, other mystical, I would say mystical more than occult, but other mystical and esoteric works of Agrippa. We're going to get to those starting next week. So don't think because you've sort of got to the top of the mountain, so to speak, with the three books of occult philosophy, that this course is over. In fact, I think we're just about coming to the halfway point in some ways, maybe a little over that. But let me just implore you to stick around, because if you're truly interested in esotericism, why wouldn't you be interested in literally books that are not even translated into English by Agrippa on the occult philosophy more generally? But here we are. So, as we wrapped up last time, we were getting up to the point in the book. This is typically section 3, book 3, where Agrippa begins to really unpack the two major aspects of what's going to go on in book 3. Of course, book 3 deals with the divine world, and in many ways, you could divide book 3 into two interlocking kinds of content. The first kind of content we'll talk about in a great deal of depth today, and that is the business of illumination. That is the point of the occult philosophy, is to become illuminated, to achieve the state of felicity. That is the point of it, and that's what he deals with a good bit in book 3. Now, he doesn't talk a lot about felicity in book 3, and the primary reason for that is there's no noetic content about felicity. Once you achieve the state of felicitas, the only thing you can say about it is nothing. There is nothing to be said about it, and therefore Agrippa doesn't talk about it. In fact, Agrippa may have never even experienced it, and therefore he didn't write about it in the book. So we're not even sure that Agrippa ever experienced felicity himself, and therefore it doesn't get a lot of pages in the book. It's hard to talk a lot about nothing. Although I say that, but of course, people like Heidegger wrote entire speeches about nothing and what is metaphysics. At any rate, that's one side of it. The other side of it is Agrippa is much more interested in some ways about the business of inducing, as much as it is possible to induce illumination and felicity. And he's going to give you the mechanisms, the various mechanisms that have come down through history by which to do that. And that, of course, takes the form of what we now refer to as ceremonial magic. So for Agrippa, ceremonial magic are the mechanisms by which one prepares oneself for the illumination or for achieving the state of felicity, rather than, in many other ways, ceremonial magic is the business of doing ceremonies to summon demons to get them to do stuff. Of course, we've already covered that Agrippa is not interested in that. So let's begin to unpack that. There is no illumination at the terrestrial level for Agrippa. That is to say, there's nothing at the terrestrial level that does the business of illuminating us here. However, there are three states of illumination that do occur, primarily raining down from the celestial and the divine realm. In those forms of illumination, take the form of either the furores, the frenzies, or the mania, to use the Greek term, forms of ecstasy and rapture. That's the second. And finally, dreams. Dreams, I think, are pretty close to terrestrial illumination, but it's still not exactly clear. I don't think that's the case, but they're the kind of lowest level down, and Agrippa doesn't think very highly of dreams, but they do, and they are, in fact, a form of illumination. So, the furores or the mania. I don't like translating this term as fury. This is where the word fury comes from, but these are not furies in the sense of sometimes we use the word furious to mean like I'm angry, I'm furious at something. That's not exactly what the furores is. Furores is Ficino's translation of the Greek mania, and these, of course, are found primarily in two places in the Platonic corpus. That is to say, the Symposium, where we learn about the mania of love, and in the Phaedrus, where we kind of learn about the other mania. I don't know that those are all the mania, but they're the ones that Plato deals with. And what ends up happening, of course, is that Plato unpacks the mania in the Symposium and the Phaedrus. Those are then taken over into the philosophy of Ficino, and Ficino expounds them both in his commentaries on the Symposium and the Phaedrus, which I would love to have a study group just studying Ficino's commentaries on Plato. Those are in many ways ground zero for the development of the occult philosophy. I would suggest, I would argue, and they go tremendously understudied, unfortunately. But his commentaries on those texts are of key importance, especially here for Agrippa. What are these? The mania, or the furores, they are forms of divine inspiration, or extra human inspiration for Agrippa. They are inspiration in the sense that one's mind, one's mens, the top part of the highest rank of the mind, of the mens, or the intellectus, these are where they are illuminated by a celestial or divine intelligence, or perhaps an angel. And in that, it's as if God or an angel or a celestial intelligence is basically directly downloading into your ratio, into your mind, the data that comes from that specific entity, or that specific entity. So it is a instant boon of information coming from these divine realms. So in that way, it is an immediate apprehension, contra Kant, who thinks that we cannot have immediate apprehension about fundamental reality. This is obviously pre-critical philosophy, but they are immediate access to immediate truths about fundamental reality via these alterations of consciousness. Most famously, the person who's I think most famous for having these kinds of experiences were Socrates. Socrates, as you probably know, had a daemon, and this daemon would communicate things to him directly. And in fact, there are moments in some of the dialogues where Socrates is talking for long times. Talking is not quite the right word. Communicating with the daemon, and there are many cases, for instance, where there are conversations about love, like in the Symposium, where they're debating the nature of love, and they can't quite come to a good argument about what the nature of love is. And what has to intervene, of course, is not an intellectual definition of love, but a definition of love that comes from Diotima, the prophetess. And this prophetess Diotima, of course, quoted by Plato, is able to give a definition of love that is sufficient. And again, this is coming from a apparently non-rational or hyper-rational kind of origin. So for Plato and Ficino and Agrippa, these kind of furores, these kind of states, they can come from a celestial source or from divine illumination. What Agrippa does, in a somewhat strange, perhaps even heterodox way is that he fuses many ideas about the Greek gods with the planets, such that Jupiter becomes Jovian. And in some sense, all the qualities of Jupiter or Jove become fused with the celestial intelligence of Jupiter, such that in some way, one obviously as would not call Jupiter a god. That would be paganism, and Agrippa's not going for that. But in some sense, Jupiter does survive as Jupiter, but as a celestial intelligence rather than as an Olympian god. So in this way, Agrippa is able to preserve, in some sense, the the characteristics, one might say, of the Olympian deities, and this is everything from the Muses to Dionysius to all kinds of stuff. One can preserve some of the characteristics of the Olympian deities without incorporating them into Agrippa's system as gods. So, in one sense, one might say that they are divine, which is to say, they are not human intelligence; they are celestial intelligences, but they do have a kind of ontological existence that is distinct from us, obviously. So, this is a weird way that Agrippa sort of preserves the Greek pantheon by basically celestializing them. So, from these celestial objects come the celestial inspirations, the celestial illuminations, and Agrippa spells these out in quite some detail. So we can get intelligent, we can get illumination from the muses. These are from the spheres in which the planets are actually set. So those the crystalline spheres in which the planets or the fixed stars are set. Those can also communicate things to us from one down to the other, and those function as basically the muses of the ancient world. So if you wanted to write some depressive teenage poetry, you may go out to the sphere of Melpomene. The Melpomene would infuse you with the best, I don't know, emo poetry you could get, coming from Melpomene. Um, Further, right, Dionysius seems to give access to a kind of disordering of the mind in a very productive way, in which the mind is sort of lined up such that the ratio can access the mens, the conscious part of our mind can access the more divine part of our mind. Agrippa seems to think of this as sort of a necessary part of the stage of illumination. It's interesting that this is given over to Dionysius, given that Dionysius, of course, is associated typically with intoxication. But again, this is a kind of intellectual intoxication rather than intoxication via wine, but maybe wine would help as well. Don't know. Apollo is, of course, associated for Agrippa with the anima mundi, the world spirit. This gives you access to instant learning, something a bit like the Ars Notoria. So this would allow you to do all the cool things you could do in the Ars Notoria, but again, you don't have to do this more medieval debauched kind of magic that Agrippa has a very low opinion of. This also gives you access to knowledge about the future. This is where you're going to get your prophetic knowledge, and it even gives you sort of bodily protection in the way that Apollo, was invulnerable in the ways that he was. Venus, of course, is going to be incredibly important. Again, Agrippa is leaning very hard on the symposium, and it is love. Love is in many ways at the very core of the Agrippan philosophy, because in the Aristotelian sense of final causation, final causation for Aristotle, of course, is what is calling everything to be its perfect version of itself. So final causation is what is luring, we might say, the acorn to become the oak tree. It is what is luring the grass to grow out of the ground. Everything that comes to be that is developing in the direction of its perfection is being lured to that for Aristotle by final causation. And that final causation, of course, is born out of God. And for Agrippa, that love, right, that final causation as a form of love is what is responsible for the world. God expanded, God created the world as an act of love, created human beings as an act of love. And insofar as we are alienated from God, we are love sick. We wish to be back in love with God and wish for God to love us. Of course, God does love us, and it is through the alignment of the soul with God via love. It is love that does that. The Venusian mania, the Venusian furor, is a quintessential precursor to the divine illumination. It is sort of like the propadeutic, the thing before which you have proper illumination. This is a sort of a precursor for the final reunion with God, which of course is going to be the ultimate act of illumination, which results in the state of felicity. Now, all of the planets and all the celestial objects, and in fact, I would say even the angels, they're all able to illuminate one and allow one to have rapid information. And these furores or these mania are the way by which one accomplishes this. Of course, the angels not having bodies, they do not communicate via the same kind of mechanism, but they impress their ideas. Their mind literally impresses their ideas directly upon the mind of the fantasia of one's mind, and you instantly see and hear them without them being able to be visually apparent to you. They don't have bodies, and therefore you can't see or literally hear them. Of course, along with the mania comes magical powers. In many ways, this is where the magical powers, in some sense, at least the celestial powers, come from. Is if you are illuminated via those, you are bequeathed some degree of the power that comes from the celestial objects. So, a Jovian kind of inspiration might give you Jovian powers. A Mars-based inspiration may give you martial powers, but it's not just the fact that you are given inspiration, but you are also, in some sense, provided with superhuman powers that are emergent and come from the object which did the illuminating. Now, this will be true of alchemy as well, interestingly enough. So that's the furores or the mania. Those are coming primarily from the celestial realm. Next in the list of the forms of inspiration are the ecstasies or raptures. These are the ones where we finally get to the divine realm. These are coming directly from the divine realm. So if you think about the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, this is the kind of ecstasy that Agrippa is thinking about. Now, these are the result of direct meditation on the divine. That is to say, you are attempting to meditate on the nature of divinity, which in some sense is strangely contradictory because the divine itself is beyond all contemplation. And one even gets the sense that Agrippa has a kind of koan-like understanding of what's going on here, where one is trying to understand something that you know that your mind can't comprehend. So you're, in some sense, breaking consciousness. Now you're taking your consciousness and throwing itself at the wall of impossibility, and by throwing it at the wall of that impossibility, you can break through to something higher. And that is to say that the cognition, the mental cognition, can't do it, but somehow through the act of doing it, you short a circuit and you're able to sort of jump over that gap. And it is in that one is able to kind of get a glimpse, a beatific vision of the divine. And that beatific vision of the divine is again the final precursor before the full-blown act of illumination in the form of felicity. So even ecstasy and rapture are not felicity. And part of the reason why they're not quite felicity is that in some sense, in the cases of ecstasy and rapture, you are the passive receiver of the divine illumination, as opposed to being an active participant in the marriage of the two. So as I was saying, this is not quite felicity and not quite divine illumination, because in some sense, this is where God is simply smacking you over the head with illumination. I don't know, many people have had mystical experiences who aren't mystics at all. They're just sort of sitting on the couch looking at something, and all of a sudden they're like, there it is. They're just smacked over the head, or smacked over the mind, or smacked over the soul, perhaps, with a divine illumination. Now, if you think about Jakob Burma himself was just a cobbler. And there was the day, famously, right, where he just happened to be looking at a piece of, I think it was a piece of pewter, and the pewter caught the sun in this weird way. And when the pewter caught the sun in that way, right, he was illuminated. Jakob Burma wasn't, at least, again, not explicitly trying to seek illumination. God simply illuminated him, and that was what was happening. So this kind of ecstasy or rapture is a very important and a very profound form of divine intervention, but you're not actively going at it. You're not an active participant in the process. That's going to be felicity. Felicity is when you're reaching for God at the same way that God is reaching for you. And in that moment, right, sort of the Adamic moment where you can't tell in the painting where Adam and God are reaching for each other or coming apart. It's the dual reach that is the felicity. It is not simply being smacked over the soul with it, but rather it isn't. You are an active participant in the process of that. Now, this is going to be more important than the furor of Venus, which of course is very important. But this is sort of like if it's a peck on the cheek compared. The furor of Venus, while a very important part of love, it only gets you into it only gets you to the celestial realm of love. It doesn't get you into the super celestial realm of the divine world, and that is where obviously you want to end up. Um, Agrippa uses a lot of light language when he talks about the feeling of ecstasy or rapture. It is like being filled with pure light. Is the experience of being swallowed up in light is often what he will talk about. And in some sense, this is a place where the divine mind and our mind become kind of fuse, or one might say that the divine mind vacates our mind, and then in the vacation of our mind, the divine mind floods in, and we have a kind of I don't know, experience of that, radical light, that kind of being completely overwhelmed by the divine. But then God retreats, and this can be a very terrifying thing for mystics, right? Because you go from a state of extreme illumination to now you're just sort of thrust back into reality, and you have no idea what happened to you, and it's terrifying in some sense. It can inspire really profound senses of the dark night of the soul and things like that. But Agrippa thinks that this is still a lower level than the divine illumination that will result in felicity. In fact, many people, when they talk about mystical experiences, at least in my experience, it's this state they seem to be getting at. This is sort of like the samadhi state. If you compare it to something like in Hinduism, it's sort of a temporary state of illumination, but it is in fact not one that is born out of you working at it. Well, I guess in samadhi you are working at it, so it's not even quite that. But this is almost like accidental in some sense. Um, it's also worth noting that Agrippa seems to believe that these happen when you're older in age. He thinks that older people are much more likely to have experiences of ecstasy and rapture, or people near death. And it might be the case that Agrippa is referring to what we would refer to now as near death experiences. And those near death experiences are quite interesting in that many of them cross culturally do contain one of the most common motifs in those experiences are light, are people seeing light. And so this is, I think, an example where Agrippa might be referencing something like a near-death experience, and I think that's just interesting that he's likening it to that. Illumination also can be brought on by dreams, and dreams are an interesting kind of illumination because they are they're much more ubiquitous. Obviously, most of us are not having mystical experiences on the daily. Some of us are maybe, but most of us are not. But most of us do have dreams on the daily, and this is for Agrippa a kind of situation where we have I don't know, it's sort of like the lowest form of illumination, and typically what these result in is one of two things. Dreams can either be and think about this as a spectrum. They can either be pure fantasia, they can be pure imagination. So that is to say, you're just asleep and your imagination is cooking up all kinds of weird stuff, right? So that's one side of it. The other side of it is the actual anima mundi, the actual world spirit, is actively impressing upon your imagination content. And so that is to say, the world spirit is actually inside of your mind, and we're all connected to the world spirit, but the world spirit is actually in your mind and is actually, in some sense, generating what you're seeing. Now, this is the problem with dreams. You can't tell the difference. You can't know to a certainty if it's just your own imagination or if it is the world spirit inspiring you. And so Agrippa talks about it as truth mixed with error is a phrase he likes to use. It's truth mixed with error. And it's difficult to know to what degree one which is which. Now, what Agrippa does recommend doing is that if you want to make your mind more pliable to the world spirit and diminish the possibility that you're simply having a rapid imagination while you're dreaming, is that Agrippa thinks there are certain kinds of things that one can do to prepare one's mind to be more receptive, to tune it, so to speak, to being activated by the world spirit. And those things would include things like fasting. He thinks physically fasting is a good way of preparing the mind, calming the mind before you go to sleep. So I think many of us have a practice, for instance, where don't be on your phone before you go to sleep. But if you have a mind that's racing, or if you like read scary stories or something. One time I had the stupid idea to read a bunch of H.P. Lovecraft before I went to sleep, and that resulted in just fantastic dreams. No, you have to calm the mind. You have to, physically fast. You have to still the imagination. Sometimes I imagine people's imagination, kind of like the uncle with the TV control that just flips through the channels without watching anything. The idea is to stop flipping through the channels, watch one channel, and ultimately turn the TV off. And that's kind of what, as a metaphor, perhaps, that Agrippa has in mind. So you can, Agrippa thinks, do things, and we'll see this also with ceremonial magic in a minute in the process of divine illumination. You can do things to prepare the mind such that when one does have dreams, one can be more certain, and certain is still a strong word here, one can be more likely to have experiences where the world soul is informing one's mind as opposed to it just being one's imagination by doing these kinds of things that will prepare one in dream states. And again, folks will probably know also that Agrippa references specific forms of dreaming, like incubation, where you do things like physically fast and you sleep in certain places, such that the kinds of entities that dwell in those spaces are more likely to perhaps influence you. Incubation, of course, was a massively interesting and very important part of ancient Greek and Roman religiosity. Also, by the way, in Judaism as well. So Agrippa knew about that from the ancient world, and he develops that in a bit in the three books. This also reminds me, by the way, that the Talmud will say that sleep is a 60th of death, and a dreams are a 60th of prophecy, and that an uninterpreted dream is like a letter that's sent but not read. Now, I don't know that Agrippa had knew this from the Talmud, but he does seem to have the idea that dreams are connected to prophecy and are connected to the active imagination. And I always like the idea that 1/60th of your dream is somehow prophecy, and the Talmud says, well, you got to find out which 60th of the dream was in fact prophecy, and you need to do the work of interpreting it. I think what Agrippa is saying here is that you can turn that number up. Dreams can be, 50 60th or whatever, reduce the fraction. You can increase the likelihood that your dreams are in fact prophecy by doing various kinds of things like fasting and other kinds of things like that. So it's dreams. Um, Lastly, right? And again, I should also mention, right? Um, with these furores, with these abilities coming from the illumination, Agrippa denotes specifically two kinds of things that do emerge as a result of these furores, or really three. One of them is you get power over nature. Insofar as you probably know this from alchemy. Remember that for the alchemists, they imagine that inside of the earth there are these exhalations, and these exhalations, depending on the astrological weather, those exhalations, when they fuse inside the earth, depending on the astrological weather, they become the various metals. So they will become gold or silver or tin or lead or whatever. Well, that's astrological celestial weather, or celestial forces have an impact about what's going on deep within the earth in forms of forging the metals. Well, if it's the case that you are illuminated by the celestial world, you would also have power in the alchemical lab, because you would have the power of those celestial intelligences, and you would be able to, in some sense, to do what the celestial intelligences do deep within the earth. You could just do them within an alchemical lab, and Agrippa makes it very clear that that one has sort of powers over nature because, again, the chain of causation always goes from the top of the universe down to the bottom. And if you are the bearer of a kind of celestial illumination, well, then just in the same way the celestial objects have an impact down here, you would have an impact in the alchemical lab. So alchemy is a place where Agrippa thinks that illumination gives you power, direct power, quite impressive power directly over nature. Of course, you also get prophecy because, again, celestial objects, especially Apollo is, as a celestial entity, is significantly higher up than down here, and at that higher up level, those higher entities have the effect of fating things down here, at least the material things. And if you know the mechanism of fate, if you have a direct link to the celestial objects, then you will be able to know the future as well. And so prophecy is one of the mechanisms by which one is able to gain access to the future. And of course, also on top of that, Agrippa even argues that if one is able to get access to these celestial intelligences, in the sense that they do the work of fating things, well, if they do the work of fating things and you have some of their power via illumination, you can alter your own fate. You become the commander of your fate. And so this is a place where you're able to exert enormous power over something as fundamental as fate by having the celestial illumination. So you can't exactly completely change everything, but you can, in some sense, increase your odds of success in a general way. So you do gain enormous powers through the celestial illuminations, and of course, again, like, who doesn't want to have power over, I don't know, um, Mars or Jupiter or something, bequeathing incredible power. One of the other things that I mentioned here that, or rather, I did not mention, unfortunately, on the slide, but I should point out, is that in above this is angelic illumination, and I don't know why exactly I forgot to include a slide about angelic illumination, but I will talk about it now, despite the fact that I forgot the slide. So my apologies. Angelic illumination is where one has mastery of the divine names. So you would gain access to the divine names. We talked about the power of divine names a couple of lectures ago, which is to say that the name like Raphael is literally gaining its ontological power because it is infused with a divine name, and the divine names are ontologically causative, which is just to say that divine speech has causative powers in a way that my speech doesn't. I don't get to say stuff and it happened. God does. God has infused these angelic beings with certain kinds of powers through naming them. The act of naming them has infused them with powers. We talked about this a little bit last time with an angel like Raphael. Raphael has been infused with the power of healing. Now, what Agrippa thinks one can do in this case is that one can, I use the language of hailing them. Hailing them. You can call out to them. You can invoke them, and the degree to which you invoke them using the divine name, it's a bit like a kid tugging on the pants or the shirt of a parent, and that gets their attention. Now, there are lower angels and higher angels, and of course, the higher you get up to the seraphim or whatever, the seraphim, for instance, basically are uncommandable because they have a direct command from God to circle around the divine throne, saying Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzvaot. You're not going to be able to get their attention because they have a job, they do it 24/7, and you're not going to be getting access to the seraphim. But the archangels and other angels beneath them, you might be able to get their attention. And you do that through invoking them in a state of, we'll talk about this in a moment, in a state of purity, in a state of intention. And it's in that you're able to get access to them. And it's through that you can make requests of them, you can interact with them, and they might be able to infuse you with some of their power. And it might be the case where they might intercede on your behalf. But again, very important in all this, they may do it. Agrippa makes it very clear that you cannot command them. And you do not have the ability ever, under any circumstances that I know of in Agrippa, where you have the ability to bind them or to make them do stuff. You're just never going to be powerful enough with any kind of sigil, or any kind of divine name, or any kind of magical circle to ever be able to command Michael to do anything, because you are you are a less than an ant in the grand scheme of things for the angel Michael. Now, where that matters, especially vis-a-vis magic and especially vis-a-vis medieval magic, is this is also true of the demons. Demons used to be angels. They share in common with the angels to this day that they don't have bodies. And insofar as they don't have bodies, they still have a kind of angelic nature in that way. And therefore, for Agrippa, no amount of binding them is possible. You're not able to bind things like angels and demons. It's not even clear that you can bind demones because they also don't seem to have a body. And Agrippa thinks very much along the lines of Augustine that the whole business of medieval goetic magic, where you believe that you can bind a demon and get that demon to do stuff, for Agrippa, he believes that it is completely a con game on the part of the demons. The demons are letting you believe that you're able to conjure them into some magical triangle and get them to do stuff, but the truth of the matter is they are conning you. They are absolutely conning you, and all of the stuff that they can do is mostly trickery, etc., etc. So this is where Agrippa is going to be, in some sense, decisively opposed to the Goetic tradition, and he mentions the Goetic tradition as being terrible, awful, and he basically thinks that it's a bunch of people thinking they can hack the system and get access to demonic powers, but the truth of the matter is that it's going to drive you into hell anyway. So it's interesting to me that Agrippa is often, I see on many people's shelves. I've gone to people's houses who are interested in the occult. There'll be the Lesser Key of Solomon right next to the Tyson version of Agrippa. And you can imagine Agrippa being like, please get me away from this. I don't, this is both incorrect and bad. And so, yeah, Agrippa is not going to be on that train. And this is a place where Goetic magic, traditional Goetic magic, and Agrippan magic are, in some sense, fundamentally opposed to one another. Fundamentally opposed to one another. And so it's worth pointing this out. So, at any rate, can you hail the angels? Yes. Is it risky? Yes. Other spirits can pick up on the hail. Is it possible that you can get access to Michael and Gabriel and all those guys? Maybe. It's probably the equivalent of me getting on Twitter and adding, I don't know, who's a famous person that Taylor Swift or something. That's like, if I at Taylor Swift, it's very unlikely Taylor Swift's going to come to my house and sing me a private song, because Taylor Swift has better things to do and she's super powerful and famous or whatever. Well, Michael's probably just a little bit less popular than Taylor Swift these days, and Michael doesn't have time for you either. So can you? Yes. Is it going to work? Probably not. So Agrippa is pretty skeptical of it, but it is the case that divine illumination via the angels is possible, and maybe a minor angel will be able to help you out. I don't know. At any rate, how do we do all this, right? So the first right, the what's the mechanism by which we build up to the state of blessedness we just talked about in the felicitas? Well, the first thing you do, right, is you have to learn to get powers over the occult world, which is to say terrestrial occult interactions. You have to get get an understanding of the occult forces operating at the terrestrial level, and that prepares you, of course, for engaging in talismanic and sigil magic. Talismanic magic, of course, is gaining access to the celestial world, and then sigil magic, of course, is going to get you up to the angelic world. So that's climbing the ladder, right? And then, right, we go from celestial illumination to the mastery of the divine names. Let's get us access to the lowest level of divine illumination, which is angelic illumination. And every step along the way for Agrippa requires, at some level, something of a mental preparation for making that ascent. And in many ways, this is a very kenotic kind of experience, which is to say, we typically think of magic as gaining stuff, but for Agrippa, you gain by losing. And what I mean by that is you have to empty the ratio. You have to empty the mind of what you think you are in order to be filled by something higher. So empty the contents of the ratio, you literally empty the contents of your body by fasting is a big part of all of it. But as you climb up, you have to, in some sense, empty the mind of the previous step so that the new step can fill the ratio in. And you climb up the ladder of from the celestial world to the angelic world to the divine world. And on top of that, there's a kind of mental intentionality that has to be the case too. For Agrippa, you can't accidentally get illuminated. Either you're illuminated because of God's grace, or you're illuminated because you've done the work. And you do the work by, in some sense, intending in that direction, that you're focusing, you're concentrating, you're meditating on the celestial object, on the angelic being, on the divine nature. And it is that radical intentionality, which is a weird, again, a weird, I don't want to say contradiction or paradox, but a weird juxtaposition of extreme concentration, extreme meditation, but at the same time an emptying out of the men's, so that when the men's is emptied out, the divine light or the angelic light or the celestial light, so to speak, can come into the men's, into the ratio, and illuminate the self. Now, is this something like Zazen or Zen Buddhism? In a sense, but in unlike in Zen, where the point is nibbana, or emptying out completely, and sort of snuffing out things in the sort of classical nibbana way. Here, it's rather than being snuffed out, it's being filled in. You empty the cup out so the divine light can fill it. And then once you've gained all the things you can gain from the celestial light, you dump that out so the angelic light can fill it. Then you dump that out so the divine light can fill it. And so you're making that ascent through intentionality, but also at the same time toward emptying out. So there is a kind of mystical attention, but also a kenosis that has to happen. And that kenosis is, of course, extremely important in this whole business. Now, how do you do that? What are the mechanisms by which you engage in that kenosis, and that sort of, again, the dual process of emptying and filling? Agrippa, as you probably know from reading book 3, Agrippa provides a ton of different mechanisms by which one can achieve this state. That purification, the emptying out, comes through ceremonies. That's why it's ceremonial magic. The ceremonies are there to sharpen your attention and to empty out the ratio. That's what they're there. That's what the ceremonies do. That's the point. They don't in themselves so much do something, but they're there to prepare the mind, to sharpen the intention, and empty out the other stuff. So ceremonies, prayers, fasting is one Agrippa thinks is very important. Various kinds of purgations, almsgiving, literally giving away money is a part of this process. So that's an incredibly important thing. Like, you are meant to, Agrippa imagines you, in some sense, giving away money. Like, because if you're attached to it, it can be bad. You need to be giving away some money. Confessing your sins. Again, Agrippa is a good Catholic. Sins weight you down. They're like dirt on a cloth. You have to rinse it out. And Agrippa thinks confession, the reception of the sacraments, those put you also, again, Agrippa is a good Catholic. Those put you in a very high state of spiritual functioning. Baptism and the Eucharist, of course, are going to be very important. Meditating on the sacrifice of Christ, right? Making sacrifices was for Agrippa. Agrippa thought, yes, ancient pagans were able to achieve this by making sacrifices. Well, Agrippa thinks that you can still do that in some ways, right? But the way to do it really is to focus on, of course, the ultimate sacrifice, which is Christ. So focusing on the sacrifice of Christ is equivalent to the ancient pagan practices of making sacrifices. Now, Agrippa, remember, does believe that when ancient pagans made sacrifices, it could arouse divine illumination. Why? Because God had grace upon those people, because they were trying in their own way to reach to God. And so God, because God is loving and graceful, God reached back. Not because what they were doing was the best or even that good, but because for Agrippa, they were trying their best. And God, they were reaching for God, God reached back. So even someone like Iamblichus, who maybe rejected Christianity, I think Agrippa had a special place in his heart for people like that, because there's a sense in which God's not going to throw those people under the bus, right? God's not going to throw those people under the bus. Also, I should point out here, Agrippa mentions ritual purity. Now, ritual purity is not a Christian concept. Ritual purity is either a pagan concept or a Jewish one. And it may be the case that that Agrippa is getting the concept of ritual purity from his Kabbalistic sources. Now, again, what does ritual purity look like in Judaism? It looks like ritual immersion. That is how one achieves a state of ritual purity in Judaism, is through avoiding contact with certain kinds of things, for instance, corpses. And if one does come in contact with a corpse, then one goes to the mikveh, one is completely naked, immerses under the water. You do it 3 times, and then at the evening, and in the evening time, you are back into a state of purity. This is the distinctions in Kabbalah between being tahor, being pure, the state of tahara, versus tuma, being impure. And these are not Christian concepts at all. They're Kabbalistic ones, perhaps, but he does mention them. So this could be a place where Agrippa is thinking about some kind of religious syncretism, perhaps, but it's not clear. Um, Now, what this does, right, is this allows you to sort of put yourself into the presence. Fasting, by the way, also in Kabbalah is thought to make you more angel-like. This is why Jews, when they pray with both feet together, because angels are thought of as having one leg. And so you put with both legs. And fasting also, on Yom Kippur, when you're fasting and wearing white, you're trying to be like an angel. And angels, they don't copulate, so you don't have sex on Yom Kippur. They don't eat, and that includes water. You don't drink any water as well. It's a 26-hour full fast. These are all kinds of things where you can sort of purgate yourself of other things. Finally, all of this, right, um, gets one into the ability and the attention where one can, in some sense, attract or lure, or one might even say seduce. And I'm taking that language from the medieval mystics like the Beguines. You can seduce the divine. You cannot compel the divine. You cannot force the divine, and that's not a thing you can do. But in some sense, your state of purity, it's in some sense as if the radical purity allows you into the divine court, and the act of intentionality gets God's attention. Your intentionality sort of gets God's attention. God's like, he's paying attention. He's really focused on, God, and that comes together such that in the state of engaging with the divine, in this elevated state, physically, spiritually, mentally, that arouses the divine grace. And in some sense, that arousal of the divine grace gets God's attention. And in that moment, once you've gotten God's attention, if you can maintain that hyper arousal, it is at that moment that God does the work of providing you with illumination. And that illumination takes the form of, as said, of the of felicitas. This idea, and Agrippa even uses the phrase of keeping God before one's eyes in all things. That's the language he uses. He's quoting, I think, Psalm 16:8. Now, as you may know, for my Kabbalah people in the room, Kabbalah has the idea of what is called having a shiviti. A shiviti is, and there's one there on the left. It is like a mandala. It is an object of Kabbalistic concentration. The word shiviti comes from Psalm 16:8. It means I have God, I have Yod He Vav He before my eyes constantly. I am constantly fixated on the divine. And the shiviti, as you can see on the screen, very clearly has Yod He Vav He, the divine name, right there in the center. And this becomes an object of meditation in Kabbalah. Many Kabbalists will have one of these. Some people, Kabbalists, even carry them in their pockets, and they're like laminated. They'll just whip it out and they'll put it on something, and they'll just like put themselves into basically a state of extreme concentration, a kind of prayer state, a meditative state. I think Agrippa knows about this practice, and he's actually, in some sense, trying to incorporate something like this back into Christianity, into a Christian occultism. And again, the meditating on the crucified Christ. I think he imagines someone sitting in a church, literally just gazing upon the crucified Christ. You have the classic idea of the Franciscan movement, where you have to come naked before Christ, and many Christian mystics would strip their clothes off and lay down naked in front of the Christ, in front of the cross, making the shape of the cross, in some sense, as an imitatio Dei, naked as Christ was on the day he died. This, again, holding God before your eyes in all things, this process of the Shiviti meditation, I think is what Agrippa has something like this in mind. And it's in that moment, like I said, of extreme concentration, extreme imitatio Dei, holding the idea of God before your eyes in all things, that the lock is sprung, the trap is sprung. And in that moment, illumination happens all at once. Divine illumination happens all at once. Agrippa is very clear about this. He says it does not happen step by step. You do not get a little bit at a time. It's not at one moment, or not in successions, but it happens at a total moment, all at once. And it's in that moment all at once where the divine light floods down from the divine into the men's. The ratio has been cleared out. All that's in there, in some sense, is the divine light, the divine mind. And in that moment, the distinction between the human mind and the divine mind are obliterated. And it's in that moment where the distinction between the subject and the object, where the distinction between me and God is obliterated. It's in that moment that we achieve the state of felicity. Felicity is that state. And people have been asking, what is it? What is it? Well, it's nothing, because you're not thinking anymore. You're not there anymore. You are subsumed, drowned in the divine light, and there's nothing to be known in that state. It is a not Gnostic state. I won't say agnostic, but it is a non-Gnostic state, because there's nothing to be known, because in the divine mind, the divine thoughts are not like our thoughts. They are not propositional. They are not, I know that, or I know why. In the divine mind, the totality of all thoughts are there. It's maximal. It's the maximal concentration of the coincidence of opposites in the Kuzanian sense. And in that sense, there is no logic. There is no logic. Requires objects and subjects. It requires subjects and predicates. God's mind doesn't work like that. And in that state, it is non-noetic. It is pure experience. It is pure being. It is thought thinking about itself, and the Aristotelian self, and the Aristotelian way of thinking about this. And so in the state of felicitas, right, you are drawn back into the divine oneness, and you are mixed into the crater, into the mixing cup of divinity. Agrippa calls this state better than magic, and if he uses that term. And so in that state, nothing can be known and nothing can be said about it. In fact, Agrippa says things like, you can only testify to it in the silence of the heart. You can only testify to it in the silence of the heart. That there's nothing to be said about it. In fact, it is the Kuzanin experience of learned ignorance. It's where you have come to a state where in every other way, you're doing something Gnostic. You're gaining insight about the occult forces in the world. You're gaining insight about the celestial entities, about the angels. You're climbing this incredibly cognitive intellectual ladder until you're not. And in the moment, the ladder is kicked out from underneath you and cognition is obliterated. And because magic itself is transitive, right? Magic requires a subject and an object. It requires me doing something to that is not me, right? It's like me turning that thing into something else. In the divine, everything is one. Everything is one. And therefore, transitivity itself disappears. That's why this is inherently ontologically superior to magic, because in that state, there's no outside, there's no subject object, there's no X and Y, and therefore there's no magic at that level. So magic is the ladder you climb, and then it's the ladder that you climb to the top and then kick the ladder out from underneath you. You don't need the ladder anymore. And in this case, the interesting thing about the three books of occult philosophy is that for so many people, they go to it again thinking that the end goal is magic. The end goal is not magic. Magic is the means. Magic is a thing. It's a tool. It is a secondary result of climbing that ladder. But the goal is felicity. That's the goal. And in those moments where Agrippa will say things like, and at this thing, I have to be silent. It's not he's trying to be silent because he's trying to be an edgy occultist and trying to hide stuff. He's just being honest about the fact that you can't say anything about it. It's a state beyond all being. It's a state beyond all language. It's a state beyond all comprehension. And therefore, there is no language adequate to talk about it. And insofar as there is no language to talk about felicity, then you just don't say anything about it. And so what do? What is the third book of occult philosophy? It's pointing you in the direction of felicity. It's telling you it's there. And it's saying, here are the things to make yourself primed for it. Here are the ceremonies. Here are the angelic things that'll get you into the courtroom or into the court of the divine. Here are the various kinds of fumigations and sacrifices. Here are all the things that you're going to need to do to prime yourself for that moment of felicity. But nothing can be said about felicity, and all that priming is just priming. You cannot induce it. It is non-transitive. You can't make God do it. But you can prime yourself. And all that priming is what the third book of occult philosophy is like. And again, we have lots of experiences like this in the mystical tradition, whether it is Thomas Aquinas getting hit over the soul and saying everything he's written is straw, whether it's the Beguines, and again, we can talk about mysticism broadly speaking here. But what makes Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy distinct from other forms of mysticism is that in other forms of mysticism, in many ways, it is a thing that happens to you. The mystical state of illumination is something that happens to you. Whereas for Agrippa, it's boot camp. You are trying to get there. You are reaching for the divine just as much as the divine is reaching for you. And it is that spiritual athleticism that makes Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy so decisively important. It is mysticism depacified. It is mysticism made active. It is mysticism made sport. It is a thing that you do. It is not a thing you wait around for. You don't live a pious life and then God illuminates you. You are actively cultivating a relationship with the divine in the hopes of illumination. It is mysticism made active. And I think that that is a so vastly important moment in the history of Western occultism and mysticism and philosophy, spirituality, because for the first time, mysticism is not a passive thing. You don't live a pious life and then God illuminates you. You're actively living a pious life, but you're actively reaching for the divine using every tool and every technique from every tradition that Agrippa has access to. Everything from paganism, Stoicism, Christianity, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, all of it. He is marshaling the entire history of Western spirituality, of Western religion, Western philosophy, all of it to create a basically a system by which one does the reaching. And once you've reached felicity, right, at that moment, I don't know what to tell you happens, right? I don't know what happens after that. I think you probably come back to the world and you probably see the world quite in a different way. And it may be the case you come back as some kind of like, I don't know, like you go fight the Balrog and then you come back and you're not Gandalf the Grey, now you're Gandalf the White and you have godlike powers. I don't know. But Agrippa seems to believe that felicity, right, is probably a goal, is an end in itself. And the more that you attempt to get felicity to get something else, probably you're not going to get felicity, right? That's the goal. Now, all of this is to say, right, this is 1510. We've just covered, in some sense, the apex of the occult philosophy in Agrippa in 1510. Now, as I said at the very beginning of this talk, it's incredibly important to know Agrippa didn't stop with the three books of occult philosophy. Agrippa did not write the three books of occult philosophy in 1510, 23 years of age, and simply go, you know what? That's it. I figured it all out. Agrippa continued to sharpen his analysis. And as we'll see starting next week, is that in the 23 years that follow, right, in the life of Agrippa, those esoteric, those hermetic, those Kabbalistic ideas are going to get deepened. And so Agrippa, far, far, far from just, taking the DOP, writing a 15, dropping it and being like, I'm done with that. The ideas are going to continue to, and he's going to continue to deepen them. And he's largely going to deepen them on two vectors, we'll see. Those two vectors are going to be Hermeticism. He's going to greatly deepen his understanding of Hermeticism. In fact, there will be much more Hermeticism in the 1533 than the 1510. And the next avenue he will deepen is going to be Kabbalah. He'll greatly deepen his understanding and appreciation of Kabbalah, which will be the other thing. And the primary book of the three books of occult philosophy of 1510, the primary book that's expanded in the 1533 is going to be book 3. Book 3 is going to be largely the book he's going to expand. It's going to almost double in size, actually. And so what we're going to see, I think, is that contrary to the idea that after 1526 and the skeptical turn, which we'll talk about, of course, Agrippa just abandons any hope at all. Absolutely not. It will be skepticism infused with mysticism. It is not skepticism that is sort of skepticism that refutes mysticism. Rather, I think for Agrippa, he will be very much in the tradition of mysticism giving rise to a kind of skepticism. And that mystical skepticism is going to be expressed in some ways in the mature version of the 1533 DOP. And so what we need to do, this will be the sort of plan for, in some sense, the rest of the core seminar, is that we're going to be deepening our understanding of the hitherto unpublished and untranslated other mystical and esoteric works of Agrippa. We're going to turn to the 1526 skeptical turn. I want to show that the skeptical turn is not a rejection of that material.
And then we're going to look at the mature 1533, of course, see how it's different and how it's aligned. And then finally, we'll see the larger impact that Agrippa has. I think it's actually minimal. In fact, I think Agrippa has not had that big of an impact, in fact, and it's somewhat lamentable to me. But at any rate, felicity, that's the point. That's the point of all of this. You go to the 3 books of occult philosophy expecting to learn how to do magic, but at the end of it, right, what he wants out of you is for you to achieve something what he calls better than magic. And that better than magic, the apex of the occult philosophy, is the achievement of this state of felicity, the state of divine illumination, and is that Agrippa is most concerned about. And as we'll see in the next few sessions, Agrippa is going to continue to sharpen that interest primarily along new works he's going to write, infused deeply with Hermetic ideas and, of course, with Kabbalistic ideas.